Hey everyone, so this is the Interledger community call, Wednesday, January 24th. Two items on the agenda today, payment pointers and discussion around latest developments on the testnet. Obviously, when those are done, any other business, happy to talk about whatever anyone's interested in. We're going to kick off with a discussion around payment pointers because I unfortunately have to drop off straight after that to head to the airport. I see Ben's on the line. Ben, do you want to start us off on that? I'll add anything that I can afterwards.
Sure. I can I'll give like a brief explanation of what a payment pointer is. So basically, on Interledger, we have ILP addresses, right? And so an ILP address is a way of saying, it's like an IP address, like how to get somewhere in the Interledger. But the thing that we need isn't an IP address. Basically, when we're going forwards building applications, we want like a persistent identifier. Because just like an IP address, your ILP address is going to change pretty often, depending on your provider. So basically, the payment pointer is an idea for a way to describe like a persistent kind of identity for a receiver on Interledger. So, for example, my payment pointer is $Sharafian.com, and it's designed to be distinguishable from other types of identifiers like, at Sharafian or like or Ben at Sharafian.com, that sort of thing, so that applications could parse that and see this is an Interledger payment pointer, and then maybe you could like click on it and it would open your wallet, that sort of thing. So the exact syntax of these payment pointers is basically a $, and then then the domain with an optional path. And if the path, the way it gets resolved, I'll just type this into the chat because that's going to be a lot easier than just saying it. So if you have a payment pointer like example.com, it would become https example.com/.well-known/pay, like this. And if you have a payment pointer that does have a path, like say example.com/bob, which you might use in like a multi-user setting, that sort of thing, where many people have their receivers on one domain. But you could also do that through subdomains. But that if it has a path, it'll look like example.com/bob. So yeah, that's the general idea there. And then we use the simple payment setup protocol, SPSP, which listens on an HTTP endpoint, would be running at that endpoint. So in order to pay somebody on Interledger, and I think I have a repo with an implementation of this. To pay somebody on Interledger, you first resolve the payment pointer, query that endpoint to get payment details using PSK2, and then you send a payment. So yeah, if anybody has questions about any of that, or Adrian, if you have anything to add.
No, I think that's great. I mean, we covered quite a lot in the thread back and forward, debating the pros and cons of different approaches. So I think if anyone's interested, it's worth reading that. Obviously the temptation is to use like something that looks like an email address because it's got a nice form like an account at a host. But as Ben points out, like one of the design goals was something that's distinguishable from other identifiers. So I think Ben's idea of a $ prefix is pretty cool. And then like what we came down to was something that's flexible, but also that has a really simple resolution protocol. So often that's difficult to do. Like if you want to be flexible, you often have to have all sorts of complicated rules that say, well, okay, if the person does this, then do that. And if they do this, do that. what we've ended up with is actually pretty cool. If you look in my last comment on the thread, basically where we ended up is something that's really easy to define based on the existing definitions for HTTPS URLs. Like if you look at the back as near like the notation, we basically just inherit the authority and path empty types and use them exactly as they are, and that's really awesome. So the spec for this is probably going to be like 3 paragraphs or something. And I think another thing to point out is, so Ben says, like, you would then, once you resolved an HTTPS endpoint, then you can use SPSP to query it. If you don't notice it, or something to look out in that discussion thread is specifically that when you query that endpoint, you'll use a header to indicate that you're looking for SPSP or like what type of protocols you support. And that's also important for 2 reasons. One, that you can version things. So, when you first query that endpoint, you could specify a bunch of SPSP versions that you accept. And so you can do some level of protocol negotiation as well as other protocols. So, we or someone else may come up with an alternative protocol for setting up a payment. This may be more complex than the simple setup payment protocol, or that has different goals, but you could still use this payment pointer as the kind of identifier that ultimately resolves that endpoint. So I think it's really cool, really powerful. I'm going to work with Ben when I'm in San Francisco later this week to put together an internet draft that we can submit, and at the same time try and reserve that well-known suffix, the pay suffix, and get the ball rolling on standardizing that. Because I think the more people that start to use it, the better as well. Even if it's other people who are not just using SPSP, we can establish that pointer as kind of the standard way to identify a payment receiver. I think it's a really nice standard. So yeah, Ben, awesome job.
All right, thanks.
So there's a question, Michiel's asked in the chat whether the old bob@blue.lp demo format will keep working. So the way you've translated it is one way to translate it. The other way would be $bob.blue.lpdemo.org, and it would be up to blue.lpdemo.org how they want to assign that. So that's obviously a hosted account. It's bob@blue.lpdemo.org. So the host can either host an SPSP pointer at both locations, or they can only use the path-based location or only the subdomain location. So when I said, about the flexibility, that was part of the design. So the host of, if someone's doing hosted accounts, they can pick, the format that works for them.
Yeah, I think maybe we should. So for people who are listening, I know the answer to this question, but the way Ben presented it now is this is how a payment pointer work, and maybe what's good to discuss is we have SPSP, which, if I understand correctly, does exactly the same thing but is a different format. So why are we changing? I think in the discussion.
That's not entirely true, actually. So SPSP has an optional discovery using WebFinger. So what we're proposing to replace is the WebFinger step, not the SPSP part. So once you've used WebFinger to look up an endpoint, you would do the same thing. You've got this HTTPS endpoint and you kick off an SPSP exchange. What we're saying is, instead of us giving you the old WebFinger style address, you get a payment pointer instead. You resolve an endpoint and then you still use SPSP.
Right. So the SPSP part stays the same. Sorry. So we're replacing WebFinger.
No, the SPSP part does not stay the same because we're also upgrading from PSK1 to PSK2.
Right. But that's
a separate thing, right?
Yeah, so I have a PR as well to add payment pointers to the ILP module, which does the old SPSP. So potentially we could backport that as well, but it seems like we're not using old SPSP anyway.
What I was trying to get to is the discussion where we said, well, we used first WebFinger and then SPSP, but we're going to change that to payment pointers because WebFinger looks too much like email addresses and that's confusing, right? I just thought we should list those reasons again for
Yeah,
completeness
I
of this
mean,
discussion.
I think it was kind of implicitly in the discussion that we had on this pull request, but sure, there's not a reference back to the web finger, the existing web finger mechanism, and the fact that we didn't think that really worked. So yeah, I mean, we can do that somewhere, I guess.
No, I just meant now.
Maybe when we're putting together the spec for payment pointers, it would make sense to point out other things we've looked at and why we didn't use them, and that'll be a good place to do that as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention it now so that people who either thought, who weren't in on that who didn't read the whole link. So basically, we had Webfinger, but it was too much like email addresses, and now we're using payment pointers, which starts with $1, and so because nothing else starts with $1, you can be sure, like, okay, this is a payment pointer, and it's clear what it does.
Yeah. Cool. Anything else on the topic of payment pointers?
Yes, I posted a question in the chat.
Hey, Dennis.
Hey, Adrian. So my question is, do payment identifiers support internationalized domain names?
In as much as URLs do.
Yes.
So they inherit from the URL specification. So I need to go and study up on specifically how well that stuff's supported. I know it's a bit of a minefield. Like you have URIs and IRIs and so on. I'm not an expert, but I think we need to have a look at that. But the idea is anything that URLs can do, payment pointers can do.
I see.
Except that payment pointers don't support anything like query strings or fragments or so on. They only support the authority and the path portion of a URL.
So then I have one concern, which is that might be pretty simple to trick someone into querying SPSP details from a wrong host. Like you,
Possible.
I mean, I would say at least, I guess the thing you would imagine is if you somehow took control of a site or something, you could change all their payment pointers, you mean? And then that way it would point to you, or?
No, not like this. So you don't even have to control over a site. You would just send, let's say, a phishing email. So let's say I know you are often paying to bob.example.com.
I see.
And then you could just append a path that says something like invoice, blah, blah, blah. But in fact, it's not really a path. It just uses a Unicode character backslashes, which are not really backslashes. So you're not really sending to example.com, but actually to another host. And then you would think.
I think it's the same. It's exactly the same challenge you have with phishing, right? So I don't know if you've seen, like, if you go and Google offline Ethereum wallet, there's about 4 different MyEtherWallet phishing sites where the URL looks like myetherwallet.com, but it's got some other characters in, like either it can be as simple as ones. So I think just, supporting Latin only makes it a bit harder, but not impossible to phish. So I don't think necessarily the problem has to be solved there. I think the problem should be solved in the exchange. Like when I give you a payment pointer and you go and query the endpoint should return you something that you can verify it's me. Like, there's a common payment problem that I think we have to solve more in SPSP than in the payment pointer spec. That's my opinion.
Like Dennis, you mentioned it would be like if you pay somebody a lot and then enter it into your wallet, enter a phishing pointer into your wallet, maybe the wallet should have something like your contacts, where it'll know, like, oh, this doesn't look right. This is a new payment pointer that I don't recognize. But I guess you can't really make people do that, so it's still kind of got that vulnerability.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe that's something to keep in mind. Maybe we can also think about that along the lines what Adrian was already saying, that maybe if there's someone we are sending often payments to, we could somehow have in the SPSP response some kind of identifier, like I don't know what, a certificate or something, and then you would
Hmm.
see that you're not actually sending to example.com, but to some attacker-controlled site. At least you could send a warning to the user, you're paying to this person for the first time. Do you really want to pay?
Yeah,
I guess the problem with all of
I
this is
still
people are
think
pretty
it
good at
should.
ignoring warnings.
Yeah, but I still think it should be in the SPSP. Whatever the setup protocol is, should deal with that. So SPSP, the response can have something like, an image of the receiver or something like that. So that's definitely something to consider, like something to highlight in the security considerations for the spec, is that, implementers of setup protocols shouldn't assume, anything about the validity of the pointer or like the phishability of the pointer. I know, so in the Gates work, this came up, and that's one of the prerequisites, if I remember correctly, Evan, you can correct me, around the prepayment negotiation was often like you would put in, say, a mobile number or something, and before you actually made the payment, it was a prerequisite that some information was sent to you that allowed you to verify who you were sending. So like you'd put in the mobile number and the person's name or something, and that would be verified in some way. So I think verification of a receiver is a kind of problem on its own that,
Yeah,
we should solve in the setup protocol.
in the Mojaloop project, that what you're referring to, that's mostly to cover accidental things. I think the problem that Dennis is identifying would be more serious. Because it's one thing to accidentally type in the address, and it's another to have somebody intentionally make an address that looks similar.
I don't agree that it's purely for accidental things. It's you whenever you're sending a payment to someone, just purely having like that's the problem with whatever payment mechanism you have today. If I give you a PayPal address that's slightly different but looks like the right PayPal address for someone you're paying, it's still, the burden is still on the sender to make sure that who they're sending to is the right person. I don't think you can somehow embed that security into the identifier.
Well, we could definitely restrict it to just ASCII, and that would just alphanumerical, and that would mean that you cannot have an Enya or some strange character in. But then, yeah, that's tough, and then it just becomes
Yeah.
harder to.
The international character set is really, really much harder than you think. Like, for example, the glyph, the thing that appears on your screen that looks like an O or a lowercase o, exists numerous times in the the full character set, Unicode character set. So you can replace that with an identical glyph, and there's no way for anybody by eye to tell it's the wrong character in there. And those are just like known hacks. We shouldn't fall into novice mistakes.
So that's worth
extent are
debating whether we
those,
should restrict to ASCII, but I'm making the case that even if we do that, we haven't solved the problem. It's a mistake to think by only having ASCII that these pointers are unfishable. I think it's a compromise. We're either flexible and have a format that works for everyone internationally, like email addresses, or we have something restricted. But I think that compromise of restricting doesn't actually solve our problem enough to make it worth doing.
I've never seen anybody use international characters in an email address.
Oh, I'll find one for you.
Okay. Well, apart from that, I think it's a cool proposal, and from what I understand, it's a number of people are in favor of it. Nobody's really against it. So should we just decide to ditch WebFinger and switch to payment pointers?
Well, they're both going to exist, right? It's more of a decision of implementing. What do we want to implement? And I think Ben's already done the implementation for this. So if nobody continues implementing or supporting WebFinger and implementation, then it will fall away as a way people do resolution of.
I put this in the spec, but I think. Oh, sorry, you're cutting out a little bit for me.
No, I'm done.
I put in the spec that in the current pull request for the new SPSP spec, I said payment pointer would be the recommended way, and didn't mention WebFinger in there. So I think maybe, unless anybody wants to make a case for why we should keep the web finger identifiers around. I think it'd be
Yeah,
cool to just switch
yeah.
everything to payment pointers.
So my point, Michiel, was that I see them as two different issues. One is should we adopt payment pointers, and the other is should we stop supporting WebFinger. I don't think those are two different decisions we can make. I don't think we need to have the WebFinger discussion right now.
Well, we're not going to hunt down people who still use WebFinger and put them in jail, but just, we have the testnet. Does it support it or not? And do we consider that a bug if it stops supporting WebFinger? We have the tutorials. Do we stop describing
Wait, hold on.
WebFinger?
The testnet doesn't support either of these. The testnet is only about doing the interledger layer and lower, as far as I know. It should not be doing SPSP version 1 or 2.
Then we want to test that.
What's that?
Don't we want to test SPSP? Like if we have tutorials about how you would do SPSP, then it'd be nice if you can try that out on a testnet, right?
I mean, you can try it out by running an SPSP server yourself as well. Then you get to see it sending and receiving payments.
Sure. Okay, so
Guys, I'm afraid I have to drop off, but I will leave Ben to close out this topic, and then Michiel, up to you to pick up on the testnet. I have to catch a plane. I will see you in San Francisco.
safe flight.
Yeah, so it seems like the big unresolved thing on payment pointers is just to what degree should internationalization be supported. I think maybe rather than trying to wrap that up on this call, we can just, anybody here who has an opinion on that, make your voice heard on the issues, and we'll discuss that and then make a decision before merging. So
I think one other thing I just thought of on the call was about the versioning. So the suggestion was to use the accept header to indicate which version you support. That's obviously fine for right now because there aren't a whole lot of versions. I'm imagining if we have more versions, two questions, I guess, would be, one, can you send multiple accept headers to say these are all the versions I accept?
Yeah.
And then the other, actually, maybe that would solve it. Is the answer to that yes?
Yeah, so the way the accept header works is actually you can put in as many things in the accept header as you want, and you can also, if you have something that looks like, if you have like accept, application /SPSP application /SPSP4 Q equals 0.8 or something, that's a way of saying I like this other one less. So you can say how much you like each of them, and
oh wow,
it should be pretty flexible on that.
I think it might be worth mentioning that explicitly in the docs, that's the recommended way to do it, where you just say, here's all the versions that I accept, and you give me back the one that you like. Because I think that's the kind of thing, if it's not explicitly done up front, it will not work very nicely in the future.
Okay. Yeah.
Hey, Ben, this is David. I have two quick questions. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Hey, can you clarify? I joined in just like a minute or two after you started, so you may have said this, but are these things formally URIs with a scheme, or is there no scheme? And then the second question is we given any thought to using the currency symbol as like an indicator of like the type of payment you might want to receive with this thing? So maybe instead of, in addition to a $sign, like allowing a euro sign or anything, or is that unworkable?
I think that keeping to the $sign is convenient because it's present on pretty much everybody's keyboards. in terms of like wanting to know what currency the receiver will have, the SPSP details include that. And see, the other question of whether it's a URI. I'm not certain what exactly is it that distinguishes that, but it doesn't start with like, I mean it mostly is just inheriting from the normal like URL spec, but just with the protocol replaced with a $ and a default path. So it's kind of like a, I don't know if I'd say it has its own like scheme. It just kind of is a simple thing that resolves to ordinary URL.
I'm pretty sure it's not a URI.
Okay.
So perhaps that's something to look at. Back in the day on the OpenID world, there was huge debate about using, like in that case, an email address, and they ended actually creating a new scheme, the account scheme, which you see in WebFinger, but it's not clear if we can extend formally from the HTTP spec without creating a scheme formally. Now, whether you display it differently is another thing, but maybe the $ can be like a surrogate for, I don't know, something to look at.
Yeah, like in terms of if you wanted to create a regex or something for this, it would be pretty unique. I think it would be, there aren't other identifiers. There aren't a lot of other things on the internet where they start with the $ and then have like a domain name and maybe a path. Or are you saying from like a standards point of view, you would need it to be a URI to be detected by browsers or what?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know. I guess I'm out of my depth there. So, but it seems like there's large debate around scheming in the URI space. So whether it's an FTP or a mail to or an account or an HTTP URL, on the formalization side, like as we try and formalize this, like at the IETF or wherever, like it seems like that might be some kind of question, I guess. So we should maybe investigate that. I'm not sure actually if it's required to have a scheme or not, but it seems like it is.
More about that there. Okay. Do you guys want to move on to testnet?
Okay. Yeah, the testnet is versioned quarterly, and we had a 17Q3 version. 17Q2 would have been ILP kit. 17Q3 was CLP, which was pre-BTP protocol, and it's introduced some. It had its own very simple auth packet, and then version 17Q4 was the one that's compatible with ILP plugin payment channel framework. So it has a few different BTP calls. It didn't use the ACK anymore, and let me think, what was the other difference? There's this auth message with which I have to send as the first message, with just a few updates to BTP, which we came up with in the weeks after we had the first draft. Now it's 2018, quarter one, so the new version is obviously the new things we've been experimenting with since last month or so. So the 18Q1 version of testnet is I added a third API point to Amundsen. Amundsen is the testnet bootstrap node. It's currently, as far as I know, it's still the only node in the testnet, although I think we're getting close to connecting Enrique's connector, which is written in Java, to it, which would be cool if the first or the second connector to join the testnet would be a Java connector, and instead of and Java team would beat JavaScripters to that. So there's a new API which I added last week. It's on port 1801 for 2018 Q1, and it supports 3 protocols, of which one is already deprecated again, and they are the new version of BTP, which I've been calling BTP 2.0. We didn't decide on that name, but that's, I guess it's the next version of BTP, and the last one was 1.0, where instead of prepare and fulfill or reject, you just send message and response, and in there there's the ILP packet, and it's type 12 ILP packet. So some of the fields that used to be in the transfer in the prepare call are now inside the packet. So that's what added this new packet type, and it's maybe more significant what has been taken away. So nodes are no longer required to answer quote requests, and they're no longer required to forward fixed destination amount payments. So now they only need to forward what we call them forwarded payments, or best effort payments, where the destination amount is just the amount that's left after each connector has applied its transaction fee. So each connector applies its own transaction fee and then forwards the packet, which has some advantages because it simplifies for the work of a connector in an important way, because now the connector doesn't need to know anything about the destination ledger. It doesn't have to understand its unit of value. It just has to understand the amount that comes in and apply the exchange rate according to on which channel it goes out, to which peer it forwards the packet. And this means that connectors no longer have to keep liquidity curves for potentially millions of different ledgers in memory, and that really simplifies the connector. And yeah, so that's forwarded payments. So they're the only ones supported now. And because you don't have to mention the destination amount in the packet, you also don't need to quote before you pay. And then there are 2 more protocols, which are pretty much there for convenience. They do the same thing. One is ILP over HTTP, where you just do an HTTP post and you put the packet, instead of putting it in a BTP message over a WebSocket, you just put it as the body of an HTTP post. And the other one, which is the one which we immediately deprecated again, and it's also the one which is used by Enrique's Java connector, is where you take the separate fields of the packet and put them in an HTTP header each, which is a bit easier as if you're writing a connector for the first time, because you only need to base 64 encode and you don't need to OER encode. But since you probably want to eventually use OER as the encoding, we decided to remove that step, and so we now just will have in the Q2 version of the testnet only the WebSocket packets over BTP 2.0 over WebSockets, and packets as HTTP post bodies will survive, and the HTTP headers protocol will disappear. So the let me see if I can paste the URL. I've lost it again. I'll just type it. So it's, I'm just typing it in the chat now. Amundsen.ilp demo.org, port 1801. and you need to include your token, which uniquely identifies you. That would be the URL you put into your plugin configuration. You should use ILP plugin BTP for this, and you give it that string as what's the name again? I think it's called server. It's one of the options. Yeah, I think the name is server. And then okay, yeah, then it will connect to that port of Amundsen, and the token is something you need to generate yourself. You can choose, it's just random, just generate some random bytes as long as they're URL safe, and as long as they don't clash with the bytes that somebody else has generated. And then once you connect with that, you can send payments over the test network. And one example of that, which was also sort of the test of, once I had it working, I wanted to know if I did it correctly and if there are any bugs. And actually there were a few bugs, which I ironed out now. And here's a pull request, which on the PSK2 repo for documenting how you would do a PSK2 payment, a sender and a receiver, via Amundsen. And you see there in line 37 of the README, it's instantiating a BTP plugin with that parameter. And so that will connect to Amundsen, and with that you're connected to the testnet. So Amundsen used to be just custom code written ad hoc to do the task of being a testnet bootstrap node, but now it contains an instance of ILP connector. So the inside of Amundsen, there's I'll write that down, ILP connector, and in there's ILP plugin mini accounts, and I think in there's another instance of ILP plugin BTP, or at least that's how it will be in the future. 1, 2, 3. And these are all repo names under github.com/interledger.js. So that might be interesting to understand how these repos fit together. So you have ILP plugin BTP, which does the BTP over WebSockets. This is OER packets over WebSockets, basically, request response. And then ILP plugin mini accounts runs a WebSocket server, which people can connect to. And each time somebody connects, that becomes a new BTP connection. And then that is a plugin in ILP connector, the new ILP connector, refactored and now in TypeScript. That is included in Amundsen, which also still supports the 17Q3 and 17Q4 APIs with the vouch protocol and the on-ledger escrows and stuff. But actually, if you have a test script where you both run the sender and the receiver, and they both use the 1801 endpoint, then your traffic will stay within ILP connector. It will never go to the rest of Amundsen, apart then from the Let's Encrypt certificate that it registers. So what can you do with this? You can write your own connector, and you can run the test scripts from that pull request, which I showed, and then you can say, hey, I connected to the testnet. But that's so 2 WebSockets, both from your laptop to Amundsen. You can also set up your own connector and say, hey, I'm going to run a node in the testnet. Just like a year ago, a lot of us were running nodes in the community network. There are now a few less of them. And so that would be great if we can get multiple nodes running in the testnet, because the Amundsen node has been up for a few months now, but it's starting to feel a bit lonely. It'd be nice to have more nodes there. And then what we can do the way ILP connector is now configured. It has a concept of upstream and downstream, and if you connect to it as described in this PSK2 pull request, then your client, your child is called. But you can also connect as a peer, but then you have to let me know in the chat. So I'll repeat the test. I do this every 2 weeks. I paste the testnet of testnets, Gitter URL in there. So if you want to run a node of the testnet, then you can come to this Gitter channel and let me know, and then we can peer as equals. And so then your node becomes a tier 1 node in the testnet, and that'd be quite cool. That's about what I wanted to say about it. Are there any questions or discussion about
One
it?
other thing I'll just throw in, we're trying to make it easier to run the ILP connector. So Stefan recently merged this big change to it, and we're going to be going over the docs for running it. So if you want an easier time running it, maybe wait until next week or so. And if you want to help us out, then feel free to try running it based on the current instructions, and please submit issues if you run into problems.
Cool. Yeah, so one of the ways of running ILP connector is running an Amundsen node. This is the script that that is being run. And you see it has the configuration hard-coded in there. Actually, that's not the branch that's live. That's still got the old URL in there. So in this one, you see that it is configured with TLS amundsen.ilpdemo.org. And you could probably just change that line to your own domain name and run this, run Amundsen as your software. And then it will, the first time you run it, it will register a Let's Encrypt certificate, and we'll keep using that the next times. So that's one way to run ILP connector. I agree we should do more documentation on the ILP connector repro itself about how this works.
Does anybody have questions about the testnet or the latest goings on with Interledger, or general questions about Interledger?
Hey, quick question about coding on the testnet. Were I to write a script to discover rates, would the best thing to do just be send small payments continuously, or is there any other mechanism I might use, like some kind of failed payment or anything like that?
Yeah, like you can send failed payments or payments that are unfulfillable if you so choose to discover the rates.
Okay, so there's nothing yet in the testnet to like exclude that kind of behavior.
Yeah, and there won't be.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, so if you're connecting to the new endpoint, then that's a default configuration of ILP connector, which means you have infinite balance and no bandwidth limits, I think. So you can do pretty much everything until Amundsen goes down. And then you get a private message from me saying, hey, stop doing that.
Other questions? All right, so I guess we'll wrap it up there. I think the big project that a lot of people who are working full-time on Interledger right now are working on is just making it way easier to run and starting to build things on top of it. We've said for a long time that... Oh, go ahead.
And ask the question in the chat.
Sorry,
chunk payment?
any updates on any chunk payments? Was reading through. Are we gonna roll it out soon in the latest version?
Yeah, good question. So chunk payments are implemented in the PSK2 JavaScript repository, and I've marked them as experimental mostly because there's some potentially bad edge cases that need to be worked through, but I kind of stopped before I fully implemented it, all those kind of workarounds, because I think they make most sense to do in response to real issues that come up. Like, for example, right now, none of the connectors that we're running, as far as I know, actually have fluctuating exchange rates. So that's one thing that you probably would see in my network, but we don't have right now. So that is one type of issue there. The current version of the ILP connector and Amundsen, like Mikhail was describing, do support what's necessary to do chunk payments. So if you want to try them out, you can connect to Amundsen and then use the send source amount or send destination amount commands in PSK2. So those are good to go for testing purposes, at least.
We'll try that. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, let me know what you think of that.
Sure.
All right, any other questions? Going once? Going twice? All right, well, thanks everybody for joining. Hopefully in the next 2 weeks, we'll make all the docs a lot easier and you can start running connectors on the testnet or LiveNet if you would like. So talk to you in 2 weeks.
Thanks a lot, Ivan. Thank you.